start, I usually tell you some sermons are vegetables and some. Today's sermon is like that radioactive dye you drink before you go have an MRI. We're going to see what's inside of us a little bit today. I also threw out my sermon, so I don't know how long we're going to be here. If I go over and you need to go, just go. Just after I graduated seminary, I was in my first church, and I was invited on behalf of the monastery that I'm a part of to go to Rome and have take part in an international congress of Benedictine oblates from all over the world. And awful, huh? So I went to Rome, and I'm at this place, and we have these headsets when the conference is going on, so that it can with translators and things, and it was really interesting. And we had these name badges, and you could tell the people were from America because they only spoke English. But everywhere else in the world, they knew at least 4 or 5 different languages, and they'd have these name tags, and it would tell what language they spoke. And I'd just gotten there, and I was jet lagged, and my hair was greasy, and I felt gross. But they were doing their opening mass. And so I go in, and I'm sitting here, and I sit next to this West African person, and they can't speak English, and I can't speak West African dialects, any of them. And so I'm trying to, offer him the book that we're going to be using, and he finally figures out that what I'm doing, and I'm like, gosh, how are we going to worship together? And something happened. The mass was in Latin. Now, here's the interesting thing. Somewhere around the 60s, 70s, there was a huge council in Rome. It was called the Vatican II Council. And up until that point in church history, most Catholic masses were, in fact, in Latin. Didn't matter where you were in the world, all Catholic masses were in Latin. And being a good little Protestant Methodist, I thought, well, Vatican II, well, thank goodness they finally started preaching in the language of the people. How ridiculous of them to keep holding on to this ridiculous tradition. That's so silly. And then I went to that mass on the first day of the conference, sitting next to a person who spoke one language, and across the aisle were people who were speaking French, and there were people speaking Spanish, and some people were speaking Hindi, and some people were speaking some Arabic dialects and things. And when the worship started and the music started, they all stood at the exact same time, and they all sang the same words in Latin. And they all knew what they meant. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is an international church, and they're praising God together. And for the first time as a Protestant, I felt like I now see why people mourned the loss of the Latin Mass. All of a sudden I understood what it was to be in a room with people from all over the world and being able to worship God together. And it was a moment, thankfully, that the Lord knocked a chip off my shoulder the size of New Jersey. All of a sudden, I understood something in a way that I hadn't understood it before. So in today's text, we tell the story of Christ's transfiguration. Transfiguration is a word that means to change over time. It means that the figure of Jesus' body changed in this moment. And it is the last white feast day, it is the last great feast day before we embark on Lent. Because what happens at Transfiguration is the last joyful moment that these disciples will see. And not even all of them, but just the top 3. Jesus continually chooses Peter, James, and John to be his, I guess you'd say, they're sort of his executive circle. And they're there for a lot of things that a lot of the other disciples don't get to see. And this is just a way of Jesus structuring his leadership, right? He's got his top 3, right? He has the rest under, and then he has the rest of the world. And Jesus brings them up on this mountaintop, and up they go to the very top of the mountain, and all of a sudden, they're suddenly surrounded by a great cloud and white light, and rainbows and light, and they hear a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, do as he says." And as Peter, James, and John almost feel groggy, they're so overwhelmed with it, they're almost ready to pass out, they lift up their eyes, and there is Jesus, and he is talking with Moses and the prophet Elijah. Now, for those of you who are maybe not Old Testament scholars, I'll just fill you in. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible-ish. There are some additions later. For instance, Moses didn't write about his own funeral. Funny how that works. But anyway, first 5 books are written primarily by Moses. They're in fact called books of Moses. They represent the law. Elijah was considered to be the greatest prophet of Israel, and so he represents the prophets. And so you see Jesus speaking with the 2 representatives of the law and the prophets. Now this, for these disciples, seeing Moses and Elijah with Jesus would have been like seeing, I don't know, Elvis. Just this idea of someone, Elvis, Ariana Grande, I don't know, pick your generation, folks. It would be like seeing that person that you've idolized and you've thought about all your life. I don't know, George Washington, who knows? These people that represent so much to you. For them, this is a celebrity moment. And you can tell that they're impressed, because what does Peter say? Hey, let's build some houses and live up here. Jesus, we're going to build 3 shrines in this translation. In other translations it says, we'll build 3 houses, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. They're ready to move in, y'all. He's had such an amazing experience. He wants to stay on that mountaintop forever and ever and ever. Well, isn't that nice? Where are the rest of the disciples going to stay, Peter? And what about all those people out there? What happens when they first get to the bottom of the mountain? They find someone already who's in desperate need of the church's ministry and life. They find someone who's desperately in need of Jesus' ministry. What would happen if they stayed on the mountaintop? What would happen if they stayed where it was comfortable? What would happen if they stayed where they had that marvelous religious experience? Well, I'll tell you what's supposed to happen next. You see, the reason that Transfiguration happens on this particular Sunday, the reason we celebrate it and tell this story on this particular Sunday, is because on Wednesday, Lent begins. Our 40 days of preparation and repentance that come to us before Easter. 40 days of reflection, 40 days of preparing our hearts for Easter. And the reason that this particular story lands in this particular place is because what happens when Jesus and his disciples walk down off the mountain of Transfiguration, but they take a beeline and they head right to Jerusalem, where Jesus will be betrayed, where Jesus will be beaten and flogged and die. Jesus is going to leave this mountaintop experience, and he is going to suffer for the sins of humanity. If he does not go down off this mountain, God's entire salvation plan will not take place. But isn't it nice for Peter and James and John to want to stay in this holy place? They like it there. It's comfortable. They get to see Jesus in all his glory. All the questions really are answered, aren't they? They don't have to fight with anything. They don't have to think about the demonized child at the base of the hill. They don't have to think about the other disciples. They don't have to think about suffering with Jesus. They don't have to think about any of that stuff. They can just stay right where they are. And the reality is, we Christians, we just love to stay right where we are, right where it's comfortable, right where we've been. Why, if my grandmother scrimped and saved for that light bulb, and if it was good enough for her, it's good enough for you. Right? Let's stay exactly where we are. Let's assume that God is done speaking, that we've reached the pinnacle somehow, that we've gotten to the very end of all that God has to offer, and therefore we will just stay in this heavenly high place in our holy huddle, and we won't have to worry about the rest of the world and its problems. And that's what we, as United Methodists, did this week. As you know, we held our General Conference, a special called session of the General Conference in St. Louis. General Conference being the only body that can speak for the entire United Methodist Church. Delegates from all over the world came, and the reason that they came is because ever since 1972, every 4 years when General Conference met, we had fights and debates over the topic of human sexuality. Will we perform gay marriages? Will we allow gay clergy? What will our relationship be with gay people in our churches? How do we understand what it is to be transgender? How do we understand these things? And the fight has gone on every 4 years, and people are continually getting hurt in these fights, these not physical fights necessarily, but in these emotional fights where people are in pain. And every year we come back and we come back, and all the time we spend deliberating this issue, we are not spending figuring out how to feed the hungry. We are not spending trying to figure out how to get clean water to Flint, Michigan, right? By the way, they still don't have clean water. They're in America, they don't have clean water. Just want to say, just mentioning that. Every year, every 4 years, they kept fighting this. So in 2016, basically what happened is the entire delegates, the entire conference said, look, we just can't keep doing this anymore. And they told the bishops, the council of bishops, they said, bishops, you've got to do something. Like, you've got to come up with a new way forward. Now here's the funny thing about Methodism. In the General Conference, bishops don't have power. They don't have a vote. They don't have anything. They can just be the people who run the conference, but they don't have a vote in anything. Right? It's one of those checks and balances that Americans are so fond of in their governments. It's an idea that they can't have too much power. So the voting body has power, and they just administrate the voting. So for the first time, we're actually handing them a bunch of power and saying, here, fix this. And so they decided to set forward a commission for the way forward. These group of people, with people on both sides of the theological spectrum, some people who believed in full inclusion of LGBTQ persons and some people who were against it. They called these people together. They worked and worked for years. And they came up with a plan. And their plan was this. We know that everybody is divided on this issue. We know that some people are for, we know some people are against, and we just can't keep tearing ourselves apart and fighting every 4 years. So what we would like to do is we'd like to do the same thing that the Episcopalians did. Every pastor, every church, every annual conference can decide for themselves whether or not they're going to allow LGBTQ clergy, whether or not they're going to allow gay weddings. So here's how this would work in a very practical sense. I would feel okay doing a gay wedding. That's my own conscience, that's my own belief. But let's say Portage doesn't. Let's say you all say, Pastor Michael, we don't want gay marriages in our sanctuary. Let's say you said that to me. Guess what? You're in charge of your building, and so I wouldn't perform that wedding here. Do you see how that would have been a way to move forward? Every person could vote their conscience. Every person could live with some sense of integrity. We would all know where we stood, and we could all move on to the more important weighty issues. So that's what was before us. And what happened is that the conference decided instead to go back to what they referred to as a traditionalist plan, which basically means when the General Conference meets again in 2020, we're going to go back to that same fighting back and forth that we've done ever since 1972. It's been a bad day. It's been a bad week for United Methodism. And I kept thinking on Tuesday, the denomination I've devoted my life to is being torn apart with schism. On the same week that my mother's dying, I was just like, wow, this is a lot. And so as we're moving on in this place, I just had this question in my mind. I believe that our congregation is open and affirming to all people who come in. You want to come in, you're welcome here. And I value that, and I respect that. And I find, in all my conversations with God, the question I keep having with Him is, am I still called here? Like this United Methodist thing, am I still called here? Because I don't want to be a pastor who's known for whom they exclude. Like, that's not me. I was picked on so much in high school. I don't want to be the guy that turns other people away. I remember literally starving for friendship, and I don't want to be a part of a church that isn't a friend to every person that needs a friend. I don't want to be that person. And as I fought back and forth, God just keeps saying, nope, this is where I called you, sit still. And so I am. And the reality is, if Peter and James and John had stayed on that mountain, God would not be able, God would not have been able to continue His salvation work in the world. But instead, you see Jesus leading His disciples down the mountain and into the very mouth of hell itself, right? Because Jesus is going into Jerusalem, and when he gets there, he will suffer, and he will die, and he will have pain beyond measure. He will experience pain that we cannot possibly imagine. And in the midst of all that, he will say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Transfiguration is a moment where we decide we're going to follow Jesus, and come hell or high water, we're going to make it to the other side, because on the other side is Easter. And on the other side is salvation. And on the other side of this journey that we're taking is resurrection. And so that is why I am staying right where I am. And that is why we as a church have to continue to keep walking on this road. And that is why we have to keep talking about it and fighting about it. Because the reality is, it's only by walking through Jerusalem that you ever get to the empty garden tomb. Transfiguration is a moment where we decide we will not live in a holy huddle. We will go out into the world and we will face those that are suffering and dying and in pain. That is the promise of this particular Sunday. So, let me say a few definitive statements. And I'm going to use my pastoral letter to do it. Where are we after the General Conference decisions as members of Portage First United Methodist Church? We're exactly where we were, a congregation that has a job to do. We will make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We must love God, love others,